The grand ballroom of Alistair Manor blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames trembling in the warm air rising from the press of bodies. It was the evening of the Duke of Alistair's wedding, and society had turned out in its full, shimmering glory. Diamonds glittered at throats and wrists, silks whispered over polished oak floors, and the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume mingled with the satisfying aroma of roasted meats and fine claret. At the center of it all, beside a towering confection of spun sugar and white fondant, stood the Duke and his new Duchess, the former Miss Isabella Thorne. She was radiant, a vision in Brussels lace, her smile as bright and hard as the jewels she wore. He was besotted, his gaze fixed upon her as if she were the source of all the light in the room. They lifted a silver knife, its handle intricately chased with the ducal crest, and prepared to make the first ceremonial cut into the wedding cake. A hush of pleasant anticipation fell over the guests. From the shadows near the servants' entrance, a woman watched. She was not dressed for a ball. Her gown was of a plain, dark grey wool, exquisitely tailored but utterly devoid of ornament. Her dark hair was coiled in a simple, severe knot at the nape of her neck. This was Alara Vance, and she was the one who had baked the cake. A few guests noticed her, their brows knitting in faint inquiry. Was she a poor relation? A governess? Her stillness was a rebuke to the room's frantic gaiety. As the Duke plunged the knife into the bottom tier, a faint, unyielding resistance met the blade. A flicker of annoyance crossed his handsome face. He pressed harder. The crowd murmured, a ripple of confusion spreading through their ranks. The Duke, with a final, forceful push, pulled the blade free, and with it a small, flat packet wrapped in dark, oiled skin. A collective gasp went through the room. Glasses were frozen halfway to lips. Fans stopped their gentle fluttering. This was not part of the celebration. The Duke stared at the object in his hand as if it were a serpent. Isabella's perfect smile became a brittle line. "What is this foolishness?" she whispered, her voice sharp. The Duke, his face paling, tore open the packet. Inside was not a joke or a trinket, but a sheaf of folded papers and a single, sealed letter. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the first few lines of elegant, familiar script. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, vacant mask. His hand began to tremble so violently that the paper rattled. The silence in the ballroom became absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every eye was fixed on the ducal couple, on the damning letter, and on the quiet woman in grey who had just stepped out of the shadows. But to understand the silence that had just fallen, a silence that would shatter a dynasty, we must return to a time 5 years earlier, when the name Alara Vance was spoken at Alistair Manor only with the deepest respect. If you believe that true strength is found not in noise, but in quiet competence, subscribe for more stories of justice served. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. 5 years before that frozen moment in the ballroom, the office of the Alistair estate manager was a sanctuary of quiet order. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the faint, sweet scent of the honey that Alara Vance stirred into her afternoon tea. Alara, then only 24, had inherited the position upon the death of her father, who had served the old Duke for 40 years. Many in the county had expected the new young Duke to replace her with a man of more conventional experience. But the young Duke of Alistair, having just inherited a title grander than its accompanying finances, was sharp enough to recognize genius when he saw it. And Alara was a genius of the land. She understood the estate not as a painting to be admired, but as a living organism of soil, water, tenants, and ledgers. She knew which fields needed lime, which tenants needed leniency on their rent after a poor harvest, and precisely how many shillings and pence could be saved by repairing the North Dairy's roof before the winter rains. In those early years, she and the Duke formed a partnership built on mutual respect. He would sit opposite her at the great oak desk, the afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, and listen. He would listen as she explained, in her calm, even voice, how a small investment in new drainage tiles for the low meadows would increase the hay yield by 20%, paying for itself within 2 seasons. She laid out the accounts, her handwriting a model of clarity, showing him where his father's profligacy had bled the estate and how her careful stewardship was slowly, painstakingly staunching the wound. They would drink tea from simple porcelain cups, sharing a plate of seed cakes made from her own recipe. "My father believed a man's land was his legacy, Miss Vance," the Duke once said, looking out over the rolling parkland. "You seem to believe it is his responsibility." Elara had simply nodded, her gaze following his. "They are one and the same, Your Grace." There was a warmth between them, an unspoken understanding that they were joint custodians of something precious. The tenants, who had been wary of the new Duke, saw the improvements. Fences were mended, cottages rethatched, and the rent was collected fairly and on time. They tipped their hats to the Duke's carriage, but they brought their true concerns and their loyalty to Miss Vance. The arrival of Miss Isabella Thorne for the autumn house party was like the introduction of a beautiful, exotic, and predatory species into a balanced ecosystem. She was a celebrated London belle, possessed of a flawless porcelain complexion, a wit that was fashionable in its cruelty, and a family tree heavy with names but light on funds. She saw the Duke of Allister not as a man, but as a solution. And she saw Elara Vance, the competent woman in the plain dress who commanded the Duke's respect, as an obstacle to be removed. The erosion began subtly, with the delicate touch of a master social surgeon. At a grand dinner, surrounded by the county's most influential families, Isabella turned her brilliant smile upon Elara. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice carrying across the table, "Lord Ashworth was just telling us of his tour of Italy. You must find all this talk of art and poetry so terribly dull. Your mind is so wonderfully practical." The comment was framed as a compliment, but its intent was clear: to place Elara firmly in the category of a domestic servant, clever with accounts but utterly out of place in polite society. The Duke, already dazzled by Isabella's beauty, merely smiled, oblivious to the scalpel that had just been slipped between his ribs. The attacks grew bolder. Isabella developed a sudden interest in the management of the estate, an interest that manifested as a series of expensive and frivolous whims. She decided the east-facing drawing room, with its perfectly preserved Georgian silk wallpaper, was drab and must be redone in the latest Parisian fashion. Elara presented the Duke with the costings, a figure that would have paid for the re-roofing of 3 tenant farms. He waved the ledger away. "My dear Elara, you must understand. Isabella has an eye for beauty. We must make the house presentable for our guests." The word "our" stung more than the dismissal of her budget. Slowly, Elara found herself excluded. The morning meetings in the estate office, once the cornerstone of her week with the Duke, were postponed, then cancelled altogether. Instead, the Duke began taking advice from Isabella's brother, Mr. Julian Thorne, a man with slicked-back hair, a predatory smile, and a portfolio of speculative overseas ventures. One afternoon, passing the study, Elara heard laughter from within the half-open door. It was Julian's voice, dripping with condescension. "The little bookkeeper? My dear Alistair, she's a relic. Useful for counting jam pots, perhaps, but you need a man with vision to manage a modern portfolio." The Duke's answering chuckle was the sound of a foundation cracking. The children of the tenants, who once ran to her with fistfuls of wildflowers, now watched her pass with uncertain eyes, sensing the shift in the currents of power long before their parents did. She endured it all with an unbending posture and a quiet composure that Isabella mistook for defeat. But Elara was not defeated. She was observing, she was learning, and she was waiting. The full dimension of the betrayal was revealed to her on a damp November evening. Alara was in the main house's deep pantry, conducting her quarterly inventory of preserves and smoked meats, a task she refused to relinquish. The pantry shared a thin wall with the Duke's private study, and the door connecting them had been left slightly ajar. Through it she heard the low, conspiratorial voices of Isabella and her brother, Julian. They believed themselves to be alone. "He has finally agreed to the South American venture," Julian said, his voice smug. "Another £20,000. He barely read the prospectus. Thinks he's investing in silver mines." Isabella's laugh was like the chime of ice against glass. "Dearest brother, you are a marvel, and the dear Duke is so wonderfully trusting. He believes you are rebuilding his fortune." A cold dread settled in Ilara's stomach. She stood frozen, a jar of damson plum preserves growing heavy in her hand. "And the little bookkeeper?" Isabella asked, a familiar note of contempt in her voice. "Has she been dealt with?" "Alistair is composing her letter of dismissal now," Julian replied. "He feels a pang of guilt, of course, sentiment for her father. But you've convinced him she's an impediment to progress. By the time anyone unravels my accounting, the Alistair title will be yours, the estate's liquid assets will be ours, and we will be untouchable." The conversation continued, each word a hammer blow of casual evil. They spoke of mortgaging unentailed land, of selling ancient water rights to a new railway consortium through a company Julian secretly controlled, of bleeding the estate dry while maintaining a facade of prosperity. Ilara stood in the cool, dark pantry, her breath held, the scent of lavender and dried herbs suddenly cloying. They had not just targeted the Duke's fortune, they were planning the murder of his legacy, the ruin of the land and the people her family had served for 2 generations. That night she did not weep. The grief was too cold, too hard for tears. Instead, a different emotion began to solidify within her, a resolve as unyielding as iron. After the house fell silent, she let herself into the estate office with her father's old key. For hours she pored over the new ledgers, the ones Julian Thorne had prepared. She saw it immediately, the subtle duplications, the payments to shell corporations with impressive London addresses, the vastly inflated invoices for non-existent agricultural machinery. Using her own meticulously kept shadow ledgers, she began to trace the flow of money, the lifeblood of the estate, being siphoned away into the Thornes' pockets. Her investigation had begun. The Duke summoned her to the study the following morning. The letter of dismissal lay on his desk. He could not meet her eye, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. He spoke of the need for a more modern approach, of new financial strategies that were beyond her purview. He praised her years of service, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. He offered her a generous pension, a final insult packaged as a kindness. Ilara listened without expression. When he had finished, she looked at him directly, her gaze clear and steady. "I will not be requiring a pension, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My father's service and my own were their own reward. I wish you and your future Duchess every happiness." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him in a state of relieved discomfort. She packed a single valise, taking with her only her personal effects and her father's worn copy of Marcus Aurelius. As she walked down the long gravel drive for the last time, she did not look back. She took a small, damp cottage in the village, a place her father had kept for a retired gardener. The village buzzed with gossip, most of it pitying. They saw a woman dismissed, discarded. They did not see a strategist preparing her campaign. Ilara used her modest savings, the accumulation of a lifetime of careful living, to fund her counterattack. She took a coach to London, a city she despised for its noise and artifice. There, she met with a solicitor her father had once described as a bulldog with a law degree. In his dusty, book-lined office, over cups of stewed tea, she laid out her suspicions. The solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, listened intently, his initial skepticism melting away as she produced her own shadow ledgers, highlighting the discrepancies with irrefutable logic. He agreed to help. Her next steps were a model of quiet, relentless diligence. She tracked down 2 clerks who had been ruined by Julian Thorne in a previous venture. They were now eager for revenge and willing to sign affidavits detailing his methods. She secured original copies of the Duke's signature from old contracts held by local merchants, documents that would prove the forgeries on the new land deeds. Her most crucial alliance, however, was with Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper at the manor. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had served the Duke's mother, saw Isabella for the charlatan she was, and remained fiercely loyal to Ilara's father's memory. Through a series of secret notes passed via the baker's boy, Mrs. Gable provided Ilara with information, with schedules, and most importantly, with access to the original forged documents, which Ilara painstakingly copied one night, working by candlelight in the deserted estate office, while the Duke and his fiancée were at the opera in London. The announcement of the Duke's marriage to Isabella Thorne was published in the Times and became the talk of the county. The wedding was to be the social event of the season, a lavish affair designed to showcase the restored fortunes of the Allister estate and cement the Thornes' new position in society. Reading the announcement in the local paper, Ilara's plan, which had been slowly forming, finally crystallized into a shape of breathtaking audacity. She learned through her network of local suppliers, the butchers, the candle makers, the grocers who had respected her for years, that the famed London confectioner hired to create the wedding cake was in a panic. He was unable to source the specific variety of crystallized Parma violets that Isabella had demanded for the decoration. Ilara, a keen amateur botanist, cultivated these very violets in her cottage garden. She sent a message to the confectioner, offering to supply him. Then she made a second, bolder offer, conveyed through a carefully worded letter to Isabella herself. As a final gesture of her family's long service, she wrote, she would be honored to bake the cake herself. It would be her humble wedding gift to the Duke, a tribute to the family she had served her entire life. The offer was couched in such profound humility, such an air of defeated acceptance, that Isabella's vanity could not resist it. To have her vanquished rival bake her wedding cake was a final, delicious turn of the screw. She graciously accepted. The 3 days before the wedding were a blur of focused activity. Ilara's small cottage kitchen was transformed into a studio of culinary artistry. Flour dusted every surface as she mixed, baked, and assembled the towering, multi-tiered masterpiece. But her true work was done at her small writing desk late at night. She compiled the evidence, the damning affidavits from Julian's former clerks, the expert analysis confirming the forged signatures, the clear accounting of the money siphoned from the estate, and a concise, dispassionate letter to the Duke detailing the entire fraud. She sealed these documents inside a slim, waterproof oilskin pouch. On the final night, as she assembled the cake, she carefully embedded the pouch deep within the dense fruitcake of the bottom tier, a secret buried in the very foundation of the celebration. She gave her final, sealed instructions to a trusted footman who would deliver them to Mrs. Gable. The head housekeeper would ensure that the Duke's estranged but deeply honourable uncle, Lord Ashworth, and the local magistrate, Sir John Carlyle, both men of unimpeachable integrity, were not only present, but seated with a clear view of the proceedings. As the sun set on the eve of the wedding, Ilara prepared herself. She did not dress in finery. She chose a simple gown of dark grey wool, the fabric of a respectable, professional woman. It was not a costume for a party, it was her uniform. Her hands, as she pinned her hair, were perfectly steady. She was not a guest, a victim, or a servant. She was an instrument of justice, about to be delivered. The ballroom at Alistair Manor was a swirling vortex of colour and sound, a testament to the Thorns' ambition and the Duke's obliviousness. Isabella, on her new husband's arm, was the triumphant centre of it all, accepting congratulations with a smile that was both dazzling and predatory. The social chorus, that great amorphous beast of county society, murmured its approval. The union was a fine one, they agreed. The Duke needed a wife with London polish, and Miss Thorne, for all her family's recent troubles, had brought a new glamour to the old estate. When Alara Vance entered, she moved through this glittering spectacle like a drop of ink in a glass of champagne. Her arrival caused a minor stir. Whispers followed her as she found a place near the back of the room, her grey dress an island of sobriety in a sea of pastel silks. She was seen, but not understood. They thought her presence a sign of forgiveness, of a servant's pathetic, lingering loyalty. They could not have been more wrong. The moment arrived for the cutting of the cake. The Duke and Duchess moved to the great table, their hands clasped together over the ornate silver knife. A hush fell. As they sliced into the bottom tier, the blade struck the hidden oilskin packet. The Duke's smile wavered. He probed, annoyed by the interruption, and then drew out the dark, unexpected object. The room stirred. A joke, a bizarre wedding favour. He tore it open, his annoyance turning to confusion, and then to stark, bone-white horror as he read the first lines of Alara's clear, precise script. Isabella leaned in, her own smile freezing on her face as she saw the words, embezzlement, forgery, conspiracy to defraud. The silence that fell was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on every guest, suffocating the very air. The Duke's head snapped up, his wild eyes searching the crowd until they locked on Alara. What is the meaning of this? He stammered, his voice a ragged whisper. In the crushing silence, Alara moved. She walked from the shadows into the centre of the room, her pace measured, her back straight. She carried a simple leather reticule. She did not address the Duke or his horrified bride. Instead, she turned to the two men Mrs. Gable had seated at a prominent table, Lord Ashworth and Sir John Carlyle. "My lords," she said, her voice perfectly calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I believe you will find in that packet, and in these copies I have brought, irrefutable evidence of a systematic fraud perpetrated against the Alistair estate by Mr. Julian Thorne, with the full complicity of his sister, the new Duchess." Julian Thorne, standing near his sister, attempted to bluster. "This is preposterous, the ravings of a bitter, dismissed servant." But as Sir John took the papers from Alara and began to read, his face growing grimmer with every line, the blustering died in Julian's throat. The evidence was too meticulous, too complete. The game was over. Isabella, her face a mask of fury, turned on Alara. You nothing, a baker!" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you do this?" Alara looked at the woman who had tried to ruin her, and for the first time she felt not anger, but a profound and weary pity. She spoke her final line, not in a shout, but in a quiet, devastatingly clear tone. "It was not my place I forgot, madam. It was you who mistook a title for a character." She held Isabella's gaze for a single, silent moment, then turned, and without a backward glance, walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind her the wreckage of a wedding and the ruins of a reputation. The aftermath was as swift as it was brutal. The silence in the ballroom was shattered by Isabella's hysterical shrieks, followed by Sir John Carlyle's quiet, authoritative order for Mr. Julian Thorne to be detained. The wedding guests, Their faces, a mixture of shock and morbid fascination, melted away into the night, carrying the scandal with them to every drawing room in the county. By morning, the story was the only thing anyone could speak of. The Duke of Alastair was left alone in his grand, empty house, the magnificent wedding cake sitting half-cut on the table, a monument to his spectacular folly. The consequences unfolded with the grim logic of a Greek tragedy. Julian Thorne's trial was brief. The evidence Ilara had compiled was so thorough, so unassailable, that the jury convicted him without leaving the box. He was sentenced to transportation, his name forever erased from the ledgers of respectable society. Isabella, repudiated by the Duke in a swift and humiliating annulment, was sent in disgrace to live with an impoverished aunt in the windswept wilds of Northumberland, her beauty and wit now useless currencies. For the Duke, the punishment was of a different kind. He was not tried in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, and the verdict was merciless. He became a social pariah, his name a byword for gullibility. Friends no longer called, invitations ceased to arrive. Creditors, who had been held at bay by the promise of his marriage, now descended like vultures. He was forced into a series of agonizing sales, first the London house, then the Titians from the Long Gallery, then vast tracts of ancestral land, all to cover the immense debts the Thornes had secretly accrued in his name. He was stripped of his wealth, but more importantly, he was stripped of his pride. It was Lord Ashworth, the Duke's honourable uncle, who stepped into the breach to salvage what was left of the family name. His first act was not to console his nephew, but to take a carriage to the small cottage in the village. He found Ilara Vance tending her violets. He did not ask for her forgiveness on the Duke's behalf. He simply asked for her help, appealing not to her loyalty to the man, but to her deep, abiding loyalty to the land. After a long silence, Ilara agreed. She was reinstated, not as a manager who could be dismissed on a whim, but as the official steward of the Alastair estate, granted full legal authority by Lord Ashworth to act in the family's interest. The work of restoration began. Years passed. Under Ilara's stewardship, the Alastair estate healed. The healing was slow, methodical, and visible not in grand gestures, but in small, cumulative details. The tenants' cottages receiving fresh whitewash, the fields yielding healthier crops, the quiet reopening of the village school she had established, which had been closed as an unnecessary expense under Isabella's influence. The estate was prosperous again, but it was a different kind of prosperity, sober, solid, rooted in the soil, not in speculation. Ilara Vance became a figure of immense respect in the county. Landowners sought her advice on agriculture. Tenants knew her as a firm but fair arbiter. She never married, pouring her formidable intelligence and capacity for care into the land and its people. Her life was one of quiet, profound purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she was reviewing the quarterly accounts in the estate office, a man appeared at the open door. He was on foot, his boots were muddy, and his coat was well worn. It took her a moment to recognize the Duke of Alastair. The years of self-imposed exile in Italy had stripped him of his youthful arrogance, replacing it with the deep, weary sadness of a man who has had a long time to contemplate his own weakness. He did not ask to enter the main house. He had come only to the office. Ilara received him with the same calm composure she had shown at the wedding. There was no trace of triumph in her eyes, only a quiet neutrality. He did not speak of the past or ask for forgiveness. He knew he had no right. He had come, he explained, for a final piece of business. He produced a document from his coat, already signed by his solicitors and Lord Ashworth. It was a deed of trusteeship, legally transferring all remaining authority over the estate to Ilara and his uncle, leaving him the title in name only. It was his final act of penance, his formal acknowledgement that she was the true guardian of his legacy. He signed the last page at the great oak desk where they had once worked together, then stood to leave. He paused at the door, looking back one last time at the room, at her. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of concession and respect, and then he was gone. Elara watched from the window as he walked down the long gravel drive, a solitary figure diminishing into the landscape he no longer owned. For a title may unlock a gate, but only character may call a place home. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet vindication and earned justice. The Duke was left with nothing but his name and his regrets. Do you believe he deserved a second chance, or was his fate just? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please tell us where you are watching from today. We will return soon with another story from the archives, because while fortunes may be built on paper and pride, a legacy is written only in the truth.